The Andes Mountains form a continuous wall along the western edge of South America, extending for more than 4,000 miles from Venezuela to the southern tip of Chile. In their central range, between Argentina and Chile, the mountains rise into a region of permanent cold, where altitude shapes every feature of the landscape. Peaks remain snow-covered throughout the year. Valleys are narrow and steep. Vegetation is sparse and limited to hardy grasses that grow close to the ground. At elevations above 11,000 feet, air pressure is low enough to alter human movement and breathing. Wind patterns are constant and strong, sweeping across exposed ridges with little obstruction. Temperatures fluctuate sharply between day and night, often falling below freezing even during summer months. Snow accumulates in layers that compress into ice, forming wide fields that reflect sunlight and conceal the terrain beneath. The central Andes are largely uninhabited. Roads are rare. Human structures are limited to occasional mountain passes and seasonal shelters used by climbers or military patrols. Weather systems move unpredictably through the range, and storms can form without warning, bringing heavy snowfall and low visibility within hours. In this environment, survival depends almost entirely on preparation. Clothing must insulate against cold and resist wind. Food must be sufficient for extended periods without resupply. Navigation requires clear visibility and accurate knowledge of the terrain. Without these conditions, even short exposure can lead to hypothermia, disorientation, and exhaustion. For those who find themselves in this region unexpectedly, the mountains offer no immediate assistance. The scale of the landscape creates isolation by default. Communication is limited. Movement is slow. Distance becomes difficult to measure. Time passes without external reference. The environment remains unchanged, indifferent to human presence. In October 1972, a group of young men from Montevideo, Uruguay, prepared to travel to Chile for a scheduled rugby match. They were members of the Old Christians Club, an amateur team formed by former students of Stella Maris College, a Catholic school known for its emphasis on discipline and physical education. Most of the players were between the ages of 18 and 24. Several were university students. Others were beginning professional careers. None had experience with high-altitude travel or mountain survival. The team chartered a Fairchild FH-227D aircraft operated by the Uruguayan Air Force. The flight was arranged as a cost-saving measure and was common practice for sports teams in the region. The aircraft departed Montevideo on October 12, 1972, with 45 people on board, including players, family members, and crew. The route required crossing the Andes Mountains to reach Santiago, Chile. Due to poor weather conditions over the mountains, the flight made an overnight stop in Mendoza, Argentina. The following day, October 13, the aircraft resumed its journey. The crew planned to follow a standard flight path that curved southward around the highest peaks before turning west toward Santiago. This route relied on precise navigation, using radio signals and timing calculations to estimate position. At the time, the Fairchild aircraft lacked modern navigation systems. Position estimates were made using dead reckoning, a method based on speed, wind, and elapsed time. Cloud cover over the Andes prevented visual confirmation of landmarks. The pilots believed they had already passed the main mountain range and began their descent. In reality, the aircraft was still deep within the Andes. The descent brought it directly toward rising terrain that remained hidden behind cloud and snow. The passengers were not informed of any problem. Inside the cabin, conditions were calm. Many were talking, reading, or resting. The flight was expected to last less than 4 hours. The mountains beneath them were invisible. The journey was not considered dangerous. The team had made similar trips before. There was no expectation of difficulty or risk beyond routine air travel. Within minutes, the aircraft would lose all contact with the outside world. At approximately 3:34 p.m. local time, the aircraft encountered the first visible signs of terrain. Through gaps in the cloud cover, the crew observed dark rock faces rising rapidly ahead. The pilots attempted to gain altitude, but the engines could not produce enough power in the thin air. The aircraft struck a mountain ridge at high speed. The initial impact tore off the right wing. Seconds later, the left wing separated. The fuselage continued forward, sliding down a steep slope of snow and ice before coming to rest in a glacial valley. The cockpit was destroyed on impact. Both pilots were killed instantly. Inside the passenger cabin, the structural damage was severe. Several passengers were ejected from the aircraft. Others were fatally injured by collapsing sections of the fuselage. The remaining survivors were thrown forward and compressed into the narrow rear portion of the cabin. Of the 45 people on board, 12 died during the crash. Several more were critically injured, including passengers with fractured skulls, internal injuries, and compound fractures of the legs and arms. The wreckage came to rest at an elevation of approximately 11,700 feet. The aircraft was partially buried in snow. Only the rear section of the fuselage remained intact enough to provide shelter. Luggage, seat cushions, and fragments of metal were scattered across the slope. There was no functioning radio. No emergency locator signal was transmitted. The surrounding terrain was a continuous field of snow and ice, enclosed by steep rock walls on both sides. Visibility was limited. The temperature was well below freezing. The survivors had no immediate means of communication, no proper clothing for the environment, and no clear understanding of their location. The crash site was not visible from established air routes. Search aircraft passed overhead in the following days without detecting the white fuselage against the snow. From this point forward, the group was entirely isolated. The surviving passengers gathered what remained of the aircraft and attempted to impose order on the immediate surroundings. The rear section of the fuselage, though damaged, offered partial protection from wind and snow. Seats were removed and stacked to form a barrier at the open end. Luggage was recovered from the slope when conditions allowed. Blankets, clothing, and seat cushions were used to create layers of insulation. There was no formal leadership. Decisions were made collectively, often by those who were physically capable of moving. The injured were placed toward the center of the fuselage, where body heat could be shared. Those with leg fractures or head injuries required constant assistance. Pain medication was limited to a small supply of aspirin and basic first aid materials from the aircraft. Food supplies were minimal. The remaining items included a few chocolate bars, packets of peanuts, dried fruit, and several bottles of wine. These were divided into small portions and rationed from the first day. Each person received only a few bites at a time. Hunger became a constant presence almost immediately. Snow was melted for water using metal fragments placed in sunlight. Without fuel, the process was slow and inconsistent. Dehydration was a recurring problem. At high altitude, the body loses water more rapidly through respiration, and the cold air masked thirst. Several survivors experienced dizziness and headaches within the first week. At night, temperatures dropped sharply. The group slept pressed together, wrapped in layers of clothing and foam padding. Condensation from breathing froze on the interior walls of the fuselage. Movement was restricted by limited space and injuries. Sleep was fragmented and shallow. Search aircraft were seen during the first few days. The survivors attempted to signal by waving clothing and using reflective metal. No response was observed. On the 8th day, a small radio found in the luggage was repaired using batteries from other devices. Through it, they heard news reports stating that the official search had been suspended due to poor conditions and lack of results. The announcement marked a shift in perception. Until that point, most survivors believed rescue was imminent. After hearing the broadcast, it became clear that no external assistance was likely in the near future. The group began to consider the possibility of extended survival. By the second week, the food supply was exhausted. The remaining chocolate and nuts were gone. Wine was consumed in small amounts for warmth and psychological relief, but provided no meaningful nutrition. Hunger intensified into weakness. Several survivors were unable to stand without support. No vegetation existed in the area. There were no animals visible. The landscape offered no conventional sources of food. The group faced a condition without precedent in their experience. After prolonged discussion and debate, the survivors made a collective decision to consume the bodies of those who had died in the crash. The decision was framed as a practical necessity rather than a moral choice. There were no alternatives available within the environment. The bodies had been preserved by the cold. Small portions were cut using fragments of glass and metal. The process was carried out privately and without ceremony. Consumption was minimal and controlled, intended only to sustain basic physical function. Over time, this became the primary source of nutrition. The group established informal rules to prevent waste and maintain fairness. Portions were distributed based on physical need and injury status. Those who were most active received slightly more. Daily routine emerged. Each morning, survivors checked injuries, redistributed insulation, and melted snow for water. Tasks were assigned based on mobility. Some monitored weather conditions. Others attempted to improve the fuselage shelter by sealing gaps with luggage and fabric. Mental adaptation was gradual. The absence of external time markers caused days to blur. Counting was maintained by marking lines on the interior wall. Conversations were limited and often practical. Personal topics became rare. Focus remained on immediate needs. An avalanche occurred during the third week, burying the fuselage and killing 8 people who were asleep inside. Survivors dug their way out over several hours, using hands and improvised tools. Afterward, the interior space was reduced further. Fear of additional avalanches remained constant. Injuries worsened without medical treatment. Infections developed. One survivor lost vision in one eye due to untreated trauma. Others experienced frostbite in fingers and toes. Muscle mass declined steadily from starvation. Despite these conditions, the group maintained structure. They avoided unnecessary movement. They conserved energy. They continued to ration food and water. They monitored each other for signs of collapse. By the 6th week, several members were strong enough to consider leaving the site. The decision was not immediate. The surrounding mountains appeared uniform and endless. Without maps or equipment, movement carried significant risk. Eventually, 2 survivors, physically stronger than the others, prepared for an attempt to reach lower terrain. They collected additional clothing from the dead and fashioned sleeping bags from insulation material. The group provided them with extra food portions. Their departure marked the first deliberate attempt to change the situation. The physical condition of the group continued to deteriorate as the weeks passed. Weight loss was visible in every survivor. Faces became gaunt. Muscle strength declined. Movements were slower and more deliberate. Simple tasks required extended rest periods. The cold remained constant, and exposure accumulated gradually rather than dramatically. Infections became more common. Open wounds from the crash did not heal properly. Without antibiotics, even minor injuries developed into persistent inflammation. Several survivors experienced recurring fevers. Others reported numbness in their extremities that did not resolve after warming. Psychological strain increased as well. With no external contact and no clear sense of time, emotional responses flattened. The initial shock of the situation gave way to routine. Conversation became sparse. Some survivors withdrew almost completely, speaking only when necessary. Others focused on repetitive tasks to maintain mental stability. The avalanche that struck the fuselage marked a turning point. 8 people were killed instantly, reducing the group to 16. The event reinforced the instability of the environment. The shelter, already compromised, now felt temporary and unsafe. Snow continued to accumulate around the fuselage, narrowing the interior space and limiting airflow. After the avalanche, movement outside the fuselage was restricted for several days. Survivors remained inside to conserve energy and avoid further exposure. Food supplies increased briefly due to the additional bodies, but the psychological impact was significant. The group acknowledged that they were losing members faster than they could maintain physical stability. Medical decline continued. One survivor died from untreated infection. Another succumbed to complications from head trauma sustained during the crash. Each death reduced the group further, both physically and socially. Tasks were redistributed. Responsibilities became heavier for those who remained. By early December, after nearly 2 months at the site, it became clear that passive survival was no longer viable. Weather conditions showed slight improvement. Daylight hours increased. Snow began to soften during midday, making movement marginally easier. 2 survivors, Nando Paradu and Roberto Canessa, volunteered to attempt a long-distance escape. Both were among the physically strongest remaining. They had recovered from earlier injuries and retained enough strength to walk for extended periods. The group supported the plan, despite understanding the risks. Preparation took several days. Additional clothing was layered from available materials. A sleeping bag was constructed using seat insulation and fabric. Food portions were set aside to sustain the travelers for a limited period. No navigation equipment existed. Direction was estimated based on the position of the sun and general knowledge of regional geography. The decision was final. Remaining at the crash site offered no realistic path to rescue. Movement, though dangerous, represented the only potential outcome other than continued decline. On December 12, 1972, after 72 days in the mountains, the 2 men left the wreckage and began walking west into the Andes. Paradu and Canessa moved slowly at first, adjusting to the strain of walking at altitude after weeks of near immobility. Their route followed a gradual incline, which they initially believed would lead toward lower terrain. After several hours, they reached a ridge that revealed a continuous range of peaks extending in every direction. The scale of the landscape confirmed that they had been far deeper in the mountains than originally assumed. The men continued walking, rationing food carefully and stopping frequently to rest. At night, they sheltered inside the improvised sleeping bag, using their combined body heat to prevent hypothermia. Temperatures dropped sharply after sunset, and wind exposure increased as they gained elevation. On the 3rd day, they reached the highest point of their journey, later estimated at over 15,000 feet. From there, the terrain began to slope downward. Snow gave way to exposed rock and patches of dry ground. The change marked the first visible sign that lower altitude was approaching. Over the next several days, they followed a descending valley. Physical exhaustion accumulated. Food supplies were nearly depleted. Both men experienced nausea and dizziness from altitude changes and prolonged exertion. Despite this, they continued walking. Driven by the practical understanding that stopping would lead to collapse. On December 20, after 10 days of travel, they encountered a Chilean arriero, a local mule driver, near the Ajafor River. Due to the distance and noise of the water, direct communication was not possible. The men wrote a message on paper and attached it to a stone, which was thrown across the river. The message explained their situation and requested help. The arriero contacted authorities. A rescue operation was initiated immediately. Helicopters were dispatched to the region. 2 days later, on December 22, rescue teams reached the crash site. 14 survivors were evacuated by air. Poor weather conditions required multiple trips. The remaining survivors were retrieved the following day. No celebrations occurred at the site. The operation was conducted quietly and efficiently. Medical treatment began immediately upon evacuation. The survivors were transported to hospitals in Santiago, Chile, where they received treatment for malnutrition, frostbite, infections, and long-term injuries. Several required weeks of medical care. Muscle loss was severe. Psychological recovery was gradual and uneven. The physical consequences of prolonged starvation persisted for months. News of the survival spread quickly across South America and then internationally. Initial reports focused on the duration of isolation and the extreme conditions. When the use of cannibalism became public, reactions were mixed. Some responses were critical. Others were neutral or restrained. The survivors issued a collective statement explaining the necessity of their actions in the absence of any other food source. The incident was investigated by aviation authorities in Uruguay and Argentina. The official conclusion attributed the crash to navigational error under poor weather conditions. No mechanical failure was identified. Changes in regional aviation procedures followed, including stricter protocols for mountain crossings. In the years that followed, several survivors wrote personal accounts. Others remained largely private. None attempted to frame the experience as heroic. Descriptions focused on routine, physical decline, and the gradual erosion of normal expectations. The crash of Uruguayan Flight 571 remains one of the most extensively documented survival events in modern history. Its significance lies not in spectacle, but in duration, isolation, and the limits of human adaptation under sustained environmental pressure. The mountains did not change. The site of the wreckage was eventually marked by a small memorial. Snow continues to accumulate and recede with the seasons. The environment remains as it was before the aircraft arrived, unchanged by the presence or absence of those who passed through it.